Hello and welcome to the Larry Arnn Show. That would be I. And my guest today is my psychiatrist, Dr. Kevin Majeres, Harvard Medical School, very distinguished man. We're going to have fun with him. He's a very wise man.
Hey there. Today I want to tell you about the Hillsdale K-12 Classical Education Podcast. This unique show explains how children benefit from an American classical education. Whether you're a teacher, student, or parent, you'll find something of value on the show. You'll hear from teachers and administrators from schools around the country, as well as Hillsdale professors and friends who are leading the effort to revive the American tradition of K-12 education. When you listen, you'll learn all about classical education, what it is, how to teach it, and why it matters today. And there are dozens of back episodes on specific topics, like teaching Singapore math, reading great books, and even understanding how athletics is critical to a child's development. Listen every Monday on podcast.hillsdale.edu. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu or wherever you find your audio.
Kevin Majeres went to the University of Dallas. He grew up a nerdy kid reading Thomas Aquinas by the time he was 10 years old. I think before that, he went into medical school at University of Texas, Southwestern Medical School. He ended up teaching at Harvard, where he teaches cognitive behavioral theory, which is the rage, and I think a good thing, but we're all going to find out about that. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Larry. Thanks.
I am an avid listener of your podcast, mostly with Sharif, who stands over there while we do this. And you were introduced to me by my student, David Morrell, who happens to be in town. He's a show pony lawyer now. And I've become a great fan of yours. And I've never had a psychiatrist, except now I have one because I listen to your podcast all the time. Your podcast is called Optimal Work. Why work?
Because work is the way that we approach challenges in life. So I got my start in psychiatry by specializing in treating anxiety disorders. So even when I was a resident, my residency actually covered the cost for me to get trained at the Beck Institute. So I got to get trained by some of the best people, including Aaron Beck, in how to do exposure therapy for anxiety. And all I learned there is it's about challenge. And right now, the main way we can approach challenges is through our work. Work is really the ordered approach to challenge.
What is exposure therapy?
Yes, exposure therapy is when you're afraid of something, say heights. Well, then you go to my office and I have a balcony, and we'd go on the balcony. And that was the old way of doing exposure therapy. So you have the person approach the thing that they're afraid of voluntarily while the alarm is sounding. And that produces something called safety learning. And you could only do it voluntarily. So forced exposures don't do any good. So you actually have to persuade the patient to approach the thing. And you do that by teaching them how their mind works, how the brain works. So they can learn about the amygdala, they can learn how you retrain it. And then they get this idea that, okay, now I'm up for it. I want to start to do this kind of safety learning. And so it's kind of implicitly built into exposure therapy that the thing that they are most dreading, which is the anxiety itself, that very thing is the cure.
How does this exposure therapy relate to cognitive behavioral therapy?
It's the behavioral part.
It's the behavioral part.
Yeah. But it also includes in some way the cognitive part. So these were two strands that developed and got united in like the late 70s, 1980s into one school of thought called the CBT. The cognitive part was developed by Aaron Beck, and that is looking at how do you work with distorted thoughts. So when people have automatically negative thoughts, then how do you help them with that? Well, eventually we got to learn how to practice this skill called reframing, which is where you learn to see the thought itself as an opportunity. So the very negative idea you might have, the negative thought you have, is there a way that that could actually bring out your best? What would it look like for that to happen? And that means then you need something to be anchored in. So something that is worth, in fact, sacrificing for to grow in. And that gets this idea of values or ideals. I prefer the word ideals. And so you help people to see how the challenges they face are really opportunities for them to grow in these meaningful ways.
Work, grow. Is there something in human nature that makes those things important to us?
It's a great question. I think that human nature, we all have the desire to know. And that's the original source of growth. We want to know things. We want to know what things are. We want to know how the world works. We want to know how we work. And so understanding cause and effect in the world, in ourselves. So I think that there is a sense that being captivated by the truth, and wanting to know more, that's in some sense, the original idea of growth in us. But that then extends to all these other ways that our nature is perfectible.
So you grew up reading Thomas Aquinas and still read him daily.
That's true, I do.
And that's a really weird thing to do. And did you grow up reading Aristotle?
No, not until University of Dallas.
I see. And you wrote your senior thesis on Aristotle.
That's true.
I've been told.
Yeah.
So have you changed? CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, is the thing in psychology now, isn't it? And have you changed it because you read those guys?
My original goal in reading Aquinas was to learn how to think. So I wanted to find something to be challenging, so I tried to find the most challenging thing I could. And I'd gone to the library in the Edina, Minnesota Public Library and grabbed a book off the shelf that was the thickest. And it happened to be the Summa Theologica. And I was a sophomore in high school, actually, at the time. And my initial goal was I wanted to be intellectually stretched by something that was serious. I felt like so much of the reading I had done wasn't serious in that way. And instead, what I found was a genius at whose feet I could sit. And I think I've been sitting there then ever since. So there's almost no other person I can read that produces the same kind of reverence in me, that I just want to learn from him.
So you run. You're a runner.
Yeah.
And so you must be interested in sports. And if you listen to great athletes tell how they did it, the way you just described that, which I haven't heard before about Aquinas, that story is exactly parallel to their story. I did this thing and I fell in love with it and I gave myself to it. And for a long time, right? So where does that come from? What made you like that, do you think?
I guess my parents had the biggest role in that on earth. I think that it was a certain guidance and a certain light that I got. And in some way, even like this experience I had of happening to choose the right book, my entire intellectual development has been happening to choose the right book every time. And happening to read the right articles at the right moments and being able to get quickly the main idea from the books that I read. But it's always felt like a guided process.
See, I learned from my reading of Aristotle and Aquinas, not as much Aquinas as you, but quite a lot of Aristotle, that your parents and God, to both Aquinas and Aristotle, are very important, making you. But the most important thing is you. And the most important thing about you is what you want. And you have your wants. You have those particular wants.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could have been a marathoner,
mm-hmm.
maybe, and given your life to that. And you like that, right? Endorphins flow through and all that stuff. But no, you like this. Isn't it an odd turn after growing up? I mean, I don't know anybody else who grew up on Thomas Aquinas, but and I know quite a lot of people who know a lot about him. You're strange. Isn't it odd to go to medical school after that? Why did you do that?
Yeah, it's a strange certainty I always had that my path was medicine. And I even had it that I didn't want to learn any psychology until medical school. I wanted to take the medical approach to understanding the person and to be grounded in what we knew best. And to me, the neuroscience and the biology and physiology, those are things that, in fact, we understood best. I wasn't convinced that the rest of what I knew of psychology would be such a sure foundation.
Sure foundation.
Yeah.
psychology translates the study of the soul. What's the soul?
In Aristotle?
No, just what Aristotle would say. What is it?
Exactly.
Not according to Aristotle.
Yeah.
What is it?
Yeah. Yeah. And in some ways, it is the life of this kind of body, right? And it is what makes the body to be what it is. But it goes beyond the body. And we can know that it goes beyond the body because our experience is not a bodily experience. Our daily experience is much deeper than that. And physiology as an experience is a very shallow kind of experience. There's a deeper experience there that I think this is in Thessalonians, right, where you see that there's this tripartite division of the person, that there's physiology, and then there's psychology, and then there's the spiritual. There's a difference between what is just physical in us, and then what is the psychikos anthropos, the psychological man, which is sometimes just called the natural man. I think that's actually not the right translation. It's actually the psychological man. And then you have the pneumatikos anthropos, which is the spiritual man. So I think that this idea that the soul actually corresponds, in this sense, to really the spirit, the heart of us. It drives then the psychology, which in fact drives the physiology. But it can go the other way too. And so it seems to me that human freedom comes from the inside out, from the deepest spiritual core of us, from which then proceed the psychological faculties.
So that's really great and odd too, because medical doctors work on the body, and psychiatrists are notorious for not talking about the soul. Every time I meet one or a psychologist, I always say, what does that word mean? And sometimes they know, and I'll say, what is that? And I don't find, I have a very good psychology department here, I'm proud to say, but I don't find as a rule that they have thought very much about that. And that's, you did a podcast lately about a book by Abigail Schreier, whom I happen to know and admire, and Bad Therapy, it's called. And you're critical of the book and in some significant agreement with the book, too. Yeah. Explain that. What's bad about therapy and what makes it good?
Well, I think therapy is a kind of technology. And so it depends on the one using it, whether it's good or not. So it's simply a way of addressing people's challenges. And you could do that in a way that tries to remove from the person the opportunity to grow by using therapy to blame others, right? Or to blame a system. So you somehow try to remove human agency and freedom, but with a misguided sense of compassion. So you're trying to alleviate suffering by removing responsibility. I think that's a deep problem.
So behavioral therapy, does that start with B.F. Skinner?
Yeah, in a way, the concept of operant conditioning came from Skinner. I think that there's actually a lot to be said for it if you understand it correctly.
I read Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and I read it in undergraduate school before I knew enough to know that what a bad title for a book. But there's a famous thing about him, a story, I don't even know if it's true or not, but it's current, that his students decided to train him according to behavioral psychology. So when he'd walk over to this room, part of the room, they'd all brighten up and pay attention. And when he walked over here, they'd all go down. And they'd track how much he was, and they taught him the way he taught rats or pigeons to go over to that side of the room. And the point then is, if you look at the world, that is causality. That kind of thing is causality of human beings. Does addition of cognitive to behavioral therapy widen is CBT behaviorism with the soul added in? Is that what it means?
I think that more can be said in defense of Skinner, actually.
Oh.
Yeah, I think so you have this idea of positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And oftentimes this is seen as, well, if someone does something kind for you, and then you thank them, you show appreciation, and then they're more likely to do it again. It's usually presented as if it's just manipulation. And negative reinforcement is the beeping you get in the car if you don't put the seatbelt on. And then the cessation of that noxious stimulus is also training. And that's what a negative reinforcer is. But you can read all of Aristotle into that distinction in terms of the ethics. Because anytime you act on a negative emotion, that negative emotion is a painful stimulus. When it ceases, the relief you get is the negative reinforcement. And that's why people act on negative emotion. So people only act on negative emotions like anxiety or anger to make them go away. And that's negatively reinforcing. But then the flip side is that the positive reinforcer is virtue itself. And virtue produces what are called virtuous cycles. That they become more pleasurable, you get greater and greater mastery, and become more and more meaningful. So you actually have this sense that when you act on virtue, when you're actually seeking the good, it gets easier and more rewarding. And that's positive reinforcement.
What is virtue?
Yeah. Again, in this case, it would be an excellence in acting, right, that allows you to fulfill your full potential as a human. So there's some sense in which it's the habits by which we act. I think that more in behavioral therapy then, we don't talk about virtue since you can't measure it. But we do talk about ideals, which are virtues by another name. It's a virtue that you're using as a kind of growth goal you set for yourself. Those ideals then, you can tell whether or not you're aiming for them. So it's a little more knowable. Am I actually ever aiming to be more loving, to be more of greater service, to be more generous and kind? So you can tell whether you're trying to consciously live by ideals. Whereas you ask, like, how generous or kind are you? Well, how would you quantify that? So psychology looks more at what you're using to aim to grow in.
I'm interested in that word work because Aristotle is very interested in the word, right?
Yeah.
The best translator, in my opinion, of Aristotle is a man named Joe Sachs, who taught at St. John's. And he translates energeia as being at work.
Yeah.
And he thinks that everything that has being is at work. And a rock, sitting there being a rock. And it's a kind of a radiation. And for human beings, we're made to work, which means to move and act, but also to contemplate, which is extremely active in one sense, and in another sense, entirely passive. You become one with something else. Now, you want people optimal work. Do you mean that word as a big word that encompasses the whole of human purpose and life and happiness?
I think that work is open to every ideal. And I think that you can only grow in virtue to the extent that you are working it. So every kind of virtue to grow in it is a kind of work. So I do think that work then is central to what it means. Even St. John of the Cross, when he asked, why do more people not become contemplatives? His answer was, because they refuse to work. They're not doing the work it takes to actually, and so there is this process that I think that there is a function of work that allows us to learn how to break every vicious cycle. So that's what first function, to stop the bad, obnoxious habits we have. And we have to learn to approach those challenges in a new way. But work also then can help us to grow in every virtue. You can deliberately practice any ideal in any hour of work. But in some sense, everything that rises must converge. And so the higher you get in ideals, the more they grow into one ideal, which is charity. So the highest kind of love, that is what directs it. So you end up then trying to bring that more and more into every hour of work. So I think that rightly understood, when you think of the traditional distinction of like, how do people grow? And the Greeks called it catharsis, photesis, theosis, or it's the purgative, illuminative, the unitive ways in the West. Work is actually the essence of all of those. It's learning to work with those qualities in mind. So if we could actually do the theosis work, which is if you could turn work into contemplation, then yes, work would be capable of fulfilling the highest needs of the human heart.
Because it's active. Aristotle defines happiness. It's very frustrating. It takes like 10 very dense pages in the Ethics before he tells you what it is. First of all, it's the one big thing you got to look for, and it's not this other thing, and it's not this other thing, and some people think it's this, and that's not right, and on and on and on he goes. Finally, he says, it's an activity of the soul in accordance with virtue.
Mm-hmm.
Activity, that's work.
Mm-hmm.
Soul, we've talked about that.
Mm-hmm.
In your practice and in optimal work, and by the way, I urge people, I will do it more than once, you should go and listen to the podcast because there's 160 some of them, if I count right. And I've listened to them all, and some of them more than once. And this boy over here, David Morrell, who's now a man, I guess, he got me doing it. And I suggest that you listen to them. And then if you do listen to them, you will want to do something. I only found out about it today. You can subscribe, and then you can get trained remotely. And I, myself, have purchased the master class and not done it. That means I'm guilty of non-optimal work. But I'm constantly reminded of that fact by the podcast, and it makes me better. It'd be better if I actually did it. But I'm going to subscribe now, and I suggest that people do. It's a delightful thing. It will teach you not to multitask. It has taught me that I ought not. It hasn't taught me not to do it.
Yet.
Yet. Very good. And by the way, this particular therapist is strict. Pleasant, but strict. So are you trying to make people happy?
Trying to do everything we can to get them on the path.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. We call it flourishing. That's another way of calling it. But you're flourishing when you can actually bring your highest ideals into even the smallest challenges.
So ideals, I think I know what yours are, and you reveal them, but you often don't define that word. Do some people have bad ideals?
I think not. I think that an ideal is something that goes by the name of a virtue, but its real essence is that it's a positive quality that is inexhaustible, but is capable of then being practiced in any action. So the inexhaustible quality separates true ideals from those that are not. So if there's some other ideal, like, I don't know, you could imagine fun, but fun is exhaustible. So fun can't really be an ideal. You can have enough fun. It's like, and it's not, you can tell that if you do things just because they're fun, it doesn't bring out the best in you. So it's like doing things to raise your own self-esteem. You would never feel good about it afterwards if you knew that you only did it to raise your self-esteem. But when you aim for ideals, it actually brings out the best in you and in the task, whatever work you're doing.
So you treat people as a clinician for problems.
Yeah.
And are you saying that they seldom have, or they never have bad ideals?
I've never seen someone who, when we did work. So for instance, one of my favorite questions is the overheard conversation. So imagine that your spouse, and if they're not married, I'll say, imagine you're 10 years in the future and you're very happily married. And your spouse doesn't know you're at home. And so they're talking on the phone with a friend who's never met you. And you listen in and you realize that they're bragging about you and about how wonderfully well you treat them. What would it make you happiest to hear them say in how well you treat them? I have never gotten a bad answer to that question.
Huh.
And what's interesting is once they start naming things, they'll find that, okay, so they'll say, I'm thoughtful, I'm caring, I'm encouraging, wise, generous. Well, then they realize that you can actually live those with your children as well, and with your friends, and with your coworkers, and with your clients. In fact, you can live them in every relationship.
So when you're trying to help somebody, you think you're helping them toward a goal that they already have.
Exactly.
I see. And you've said a couple of things that imply that the work of pursuing those goals is their work and they can't do it. You can't do it for them.
That's right.
See, isn't that great? You'd be, I hereby invite you to join the faculty of Hillsdale College. You are fully qualified to do that.
That's very kind of you. I'd love to be able to do it.
Sometime when you get a sabbatical.
That's right.
There you go. The offer's on the table.
Wonderful.
In the beginning of the ethics, in the first sentence of the ethics, which in graduate school, we spent a month reading. And he says, every art and every inquiry and every action and every choice seems to aim at some good. And therefore, it has been beautifully said that the good is that for which all things aim. And that's an extremely pleasing sentence. I've never encountered anybody who read that and think, that's really cool. And then you ask the question, okay, what about a murder? What about Hitler? Because those are actions and choices. And Hitler killed, 10 million people? More if you count the war casualties. Then it's 50 million, maybe. What about that? Did he have bad ideals?
My guess is that he was driven by something other than ideals. And he wasn't trying to stretch himself, right, so that every challenge could bring out his best. He wasn't striving to give his best to those around him. He wasn't actually sincerely seeking the good of those around him.
But they say that Aristotle says every one of those things does. That means his actions, his choices, his inquiries.
But the good he was seeking could have been some form of relief from, say, feelings of shame, which we know was a deep motivator for him.
Yeah.
And so he was constantly seeking, as far as I have heard and read, relief from this painful experience of shame. And in fact, that's the essence of every vicious cycle. So you are fleeing from the painful thing, and then the ends justify the means. I mean, that this is something you see as the above all. You're willing to do anything to obtain it.
Churchill wasn't given to mocking people, but he mocked Hitler a lot. And he often mocked him as a coward and somebody inadequate and knowing it. And so you're saying maybe.
I think that's right. I think, in fact, all of us can be tempted to aim for particular outcomes and to think that somehow once we attain that outcome, then we'll start doing better. And I think that, this is like the reductio ad Hitlerum, but I think that, Hitler took that to an extreme. And so you can see what happens, that when they think that they can, there's some outcome that they're willing to sacrifice everything for, they're willing to sacrifice ideals for outcomes. And I think that, in fact, the virtuous thing is always being willing to sacrifice outcomes for ideals. It's like, what direction is the sacrifice going?
It's no secret that Americans are more divided than ever. And it's not just over what policies will improve our great country. No, it's over whether America is great at all, whether America deserves our love. That's why Imprimis is so important. Imprimis looks at the issues of the day from a constitutional perspective, reminding citizens always of our great heritage of liberty. For more than 50 years, Imprimis has featured speeches from the smartest conservative thinkers and writers at Hillsdale events. These days, Hillsdale publishes people like Molly Hemingway, Andy Puzder, Harmeet Dillon, and Chris Rufo. Over 6.4 million American households and businesses receive Imprimis absolutely free. And I urge you to sign up for it today at no charge. To get your free lifetime subscription, go to hillsdale.edu/lifetime right now. Or text the word Imprimis to 71844 and we'll send you a link to sign up for your free lifetime subscription. That's IMPRIMIS to 71844.
We have good experiences with marriage at Hillsdale College. Almost always, but not always. We had one breakdown some years ago, and because one of the parties appealed to me and even lived with us for a few days, I found out what they were doing. Very wise people, good ideals. They were spending their day, each of them, planning the argument of the evening so they could win it and get the marriage the way they wanted it to be.
Exactly.
It was a combat.
Yeah.
They waged combat on each other for a decade and had a bunch of children,
Mm-hmm.
and then it fell apart. And it was mind-boggling to me.
I always think it's great for married couples to think of, if they want to grow, one of the best ways of framing it is, how would I surprise my spouse tonight? Like by being particularly encouraging. When you think of surprising the other, it gives you permission to do things you normally wouldn't do. And they don't have to be sustainable, but then it can create a whole new dynamic.
I'm blessed with a good marriage, and it's because I married above myself. And the woman said, I would like to be more like Penny and my wife. And I said, yeah, me too. That's hard. So you think when you're counseling somebody that, first of all, you're helping them get what they're bound to want. And second, that they will want to do the work, else it can't be done.
And they suffer because they're not doing it yet. And they need someone to help show them how to make it easier.
I see.
And I can make it easier for people. So my specialty is anxiety disorders. Now, trying to live your life running from anxiety is one of the most difficult things you could ever set out to do. But living your life trying to eagerly embrace it, to fully feel it, prudentially done, that is something where only the first time is hard. Because the second time is easier, and then the next time is easier, the next time is easier. So my whole goal was, how do I help people overcome their anxiety disorder in as few sessions as possible? And that's what I practiced single-mindedly for like 10 years. And I learned that if I could help them view their, whatever the trigger is, to view it now as the perfect opportunity for a new kind of learning, and then to be open up fully to the feelings of that when it comes, and to lean into it, that even one session is enough. Because you can make such progress in one session, they have this aha moment that they can relate now to their own anxiety in a completely new way. And that there's this sense of freedom and liberation that you never see anytime else, unless perhaps someone is like freed from prison, from when they're unjustly in prison, but you don't see this often, this sudden sense of liberation and freedom really flourishing.
You have said, I've heard you say that CBT works fast compared to other approaches, whatever they are. I don't know anything about it. But why? Why does it work fast?
Maybe the shortest answer is because it's skills-based, not therapist-based. So it's not you're developing a relationship with a therapist that is meant to accompany you the whole of your life. Now, that could happen, and it's not necessarily bad, but that's not CBT. The idea of CBT is that people have the solutions inside of themselves, in that they already are capable of doing this work. Now, one way, this might sound strange, but why do people develop anxiety disorders? Because they are so highly trainable. Their amygdala is so highly ready to be trained that when they avoided things, it quickly learned those things are threats. And then now it's more quick to sound the alarm. They avoid it again, it's even quicker. So they have a very highly trainable amygdala. Well, that's not seen in CBT as a bad thing. That's actually the condition for progress. So the very thing that brought them in is actually the ticket to the cure. They can retrain their amygdala. What has to change is their behavior.
So for that to work, by the way, this is a logical point. They, and by they we're referring to the soul, that has to be something different from the amygdala.
Exactly.
They got to be able to stand outside it and look at it and make it behave.
Not only that, but their amygdala defers to their behavior as if deferring to the authority.
I see.
So if you approach something while the alarm is sounding, your alarm learns.
I had Ian McGilchrist on this thing. Great.
He's a wonderful psychiatrist.
I learned of him from you. And I asked him about you, and he said good things. But I marveled at him because he's the expert on parts of the brain and what it does. And I was interested in that in part because you talk about that. Left brain, right brain, all that, And everyone should go and read the De Anima on the Soul, Perisuke, by Aristotle. It's a little dense, but it's short. And in that, he makes the claim that the soul is immaterial. And if it weren't, you wouldn't be able to understand or have objective knowledge of an object outside yourself. So, but the brain has parts, and you're talking about one of them, and it divides into these hemispheres. I explored that with Ian McGregor. How can we be free if these parts are important? Address that a little bit.
Yeah, there has to be something deeper than the parts that is the source of freedom. Even so, the right brain, left brain is a very interesting divide. So the left brain being primarily about manipulation and outcomes, and the right brain is actually primarily about ideals and bonds, the meaningful things in life. So if you can, the height of the right brain is silent love, which is the definition of contemplation. So contemplation is the highest thing that the right brain can do. But does contemplation end in the right brain? Is that where it's actually taking place? By no means. There is something deeper than it.
Silent love. In the Ethics and the De Anima, the act of contemplation, which is the highest human activity, is not calculation. It's not going from thing to thing the way we put arguments together, the way we are in this recording, for example. It's receptive. It's beholding, but in a way that's an active participation. And that's what we mean by silent. You don't have to say anything. You don't really have to have a reasoning process. You get yourself to where you see it, fully see it, give yourself to it. It is active in that way. Do you think people want that by nature?
Yeah, I think it's the only thing people want.
Only thing.
I think that's the ultimate thing that people want. I think that in some ways, in my mind, the goal of a university education, I think, is ultimately to make people capable of metaphysics. So, and capable of experiential metaphysics.
Define metaphysics.
So metaphysics here is broadly the study of being, but it's understanding the difference, it's understanding the analogy of being, and that created substances are being held in being by God. And so that when you experience your own act of being, you're actually coming as close as you can to the immediate experience of God. And so I think that the height of philosophy is actually to help people understand this pathway to actually experience God. And so it should be that in universities, we're able to take and to train those who are capable of receiving it to get to this deeper reality. I think it's this insight that created the Middle Ages, the understanding of being in metaphysics, and the sense of the presence of God. But that I think is the height of learning, but it's also I think the height of practice. It's the height of work, to actually understand how do you actually stay in the presence of God all day long.
My friend Roger Kimball of Encounter Books and The New Criterion gave me a book lately, and I'd never heard of the book. It's called The Gothic Cathedral by Otto von Stimpson. You read it?
No, I haven't.
Yeah, you should read it. If you ever mention somebody should read a book, I always read it, but you don't have to read mine. Its claim, I haven't finished it yet, but its claim is that this thing that you just admired about the Middle Ages, which is this picture of all nature, of the cosmos, and the wish of the soul to behold the highest things in it, that was the explicit purpose behind the design of the Gothic Cathedral. And that it wasn't, when I say it was explicit, it's not just that it was apparent in it. The ones who designed the first ones said so. So it gave rise to this structure of thought and to these structures. And you see, both the thinking, the thought, and the design and building of the structures are work. Physical work in the end. Big physical work in the end. And it seems to me we use metaphors for civilization all the time. They erected a great structure on every level of human undertaking. and they knew it, and they were proud of it. And it was optimal work. And you don't even have to like the cathedral, which I happen to do, and have a bent for that kind of thing. Trying to reproduce it at Hillsdale College in some ways can. But you don't have to favor that style to admire and even be awed by that thing. And you're saying, people, your patients, are so awed by such things.
I think that in many times I don't talk to my patients about contemplation unless they bring it to the table. I think that for those who have faith, then it very naturally comes up, and they can start to see that faith is the widest context we can have for viewing any challenge in life. And so reframing means widening the context in which you view a challenge until you can see how it's an opportunity for growth.
You do talk about ideals all the time.
All the time.
And everybody's got those. And don't those lead to contemplation if you follow them?
I think they do. Yeah. I think that if we could actually get to the point where, even higher than ideals are bonds, because the bond is love, and that's the highest ideal. And the bond is the giving and receiving of love. And so it's passivity and activity perfectly combined. And so when people are looking at improving the bonds in their life, the work that I do with them feels that it's at its best. It's at its kind of most glorious. Because if you're really serious about building the bond, that leads you to be sincere and humble and generous. And I think that those three combined are what make magnanimity. So magnanimity, being, I think, the virtue that makes every virtue better. But it does that through the bonds that we have.
I feel better about something I did. My younger daughter got married, and we had to speak. And I now have a second worthless son-in-law, as I like to say. They're actually both very fine young men. But I said, I wonder if marriage is not the most important ceremony. And the reason is, these things that are celebrated in marriage are necessary to good living, but this is an iron commitment to another. In other words, it takes these things, fidelity, work, service, loyalty, it takes all those things, and it means a commitment to another, seals it in a bond. You think like that?
I totally do.
Yeah. That's, people need that, right?
And I think the ultimate goal of contemplation is to experience your own act of being as your end of the bond. Your end of the bond with God, who then is sustaining you in being. So I think that the marital, the spousal relationship, that bond is, I think, the image of the kind of even more primordial bond, the bond with God. C.S.
Lewis writes an argument that I've always loved and find effective to understanding in me and my friends and students. And that is, he says that you have the evidence of God inside you all the time. Because first of all, you know that you can do things that are essential that other creatures around you cannot do. And you know that you cannot do them perfectly. Also, you know that in you, there are higher and lower bits. And so just look at yourself and you'll see that something more perfect is implied. And that seems to me. But when you talk so much about ideals, first of all, in your practice, as you relate it in your podcast, that's a thing to conjure with. People agree with that, right? Your ideals. And I could accuse you of being a relativist. I'm on the alert for that because it's everywhere in the world. But it's a thing to conjure with, and you don't really even have quite to define what that might be, because what you're saying is their definition is likely to be good. even
that's right.
extremely likely to be good. Well, in fact, you said in your practice, in all cases.
I think that only true virtues can produce virtuous cycles within us. And that's something that false ideals would never be able to do.
And I think that's very true and wonderful for you to articulate. I also think it's extremely important to the whole being of human beings and the structure of the world that people are given to that knowledge. I'll say one more thing about Hitler because it's my line of work. I'm in the business of understanding tyrants and statesmen. One way to put what I do. Aristotle says that it takes extreme determination and unusual capacity to make yourself into the highest kind of virtuous person and also to make yourself into the highest kind of vicious person. You got to work at it. And I think it's actually true in Hitler's life that he willfully destroyed himself. And at the end, he was lost. And the perfect ending came to him. He shot himself. And that was right. That's where that is the end that he chose, which means if he chose it, he might have chosen another one. And the fact that he thought he was a good painter and he wasn't, and his mother doted on him and his father ignored him and all that, that wasn't it. He had this incredibly powerful will, and he devoted it to the destruction of everything, including himself. And that's rare. I'll also add about Hitler, because it's of interest to me. He never talked like that. He didn't stand up and say, I want to kill all these Jews because I don't like them, or because I want to prove to God that he can't preserve them from forever as he promised. He said, they've done wrong and they have to be constrained. In other words, in public, he's always making a claim of justice. And that means that he knew, as you know, that appealing to false ideals is unpersuasive. That's great.
That's right. Viktor Frankl had said that no matter what the psychiatric disorder and how severe it is, there is always a core of freedom that remains.
Yeah, tell people who he is.
So Viktor Frankl is a Viennese psychiatrist who got put in Auschwitz, and afterwards he wrote a book, Man's Search for Meaning, which became very popular. He had a kind of theory that was called logotherapy, but I always have to tell people, because I have all these good people that ask me about logotherapy and whether I practice it. And I'll say, well,
I have asked you that.
Yeah, it's not really a form of therapy.
Yeah.
So it's an idea that meaning can be found in any circumstance.
Yeah.
And it's up to you to find the meaning in it. In that, he was a precursor to CBT.
Yeah.
That's the precursor of the cognitive element. He also had this idea of paradoxic intention, that whatever the problem is, you make it the goal. So, for instance, if your problem is insomnia, then you make insomnia the goal. You try to stay up. If stuttering is the problem, you make stuttering the goal. And paradoxic intention can actually cure many things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And in some ways, that's the basis of, well, not that it was founded on it, but it's very consonant with the idea of exposure therapy. So anxiety is the problem, then make anxiety the goal. You'll soon find you can't make yourself anxious anymore.
Everyone, in my opinion, everyone should read Man's Search for Meaning. It is an account of the meaning, almost the happiness, to be found in Auschwitz.
Yeah.
And he must have been, he died in, sometime in the last 20 years, I think. And he must have been a very great man. Wrote that book.
Yeah, I tried to when I was in college, I read every work that he had in English. Yeah. And I was deeply impressed by him.
Yeah. I'll go on a little bit more about this. I've only read that book, but I've read it more than once. There's a night when it's cold and the guards have been bad and the food had been particularly bad and they're freezing. And somebody says, it's the only thing where he really demonstrates, indicates his own greatness in the camp. And he says, somebody calls out, "Tell us something, Victor." And he relates what he said, which is, this has meaning. Our suffering is not for nothing. People will know about it and learn from it. And everyone was comforted by that.
Mm-hmm.
I just think that's, the book is an amazing achievement. I don't know if I know any higher achievement anybody ever made than giving that speech in that camp. It's a remarkable thing. Okay, I want to talk about the society a little bit. Walker Percy writes something like, I looked for the quote and I couldn't find it. We live in the age of therapy and comfort, or something like that. And in the society, there have been these enormous changes in the structure of the government, in the way things work. And we think we can fix everything, generally these days, by applying what are becoming the standard methods, well established. What about that? There are more people in therapy than ever, I read.
Mm-hmm.
Does that mean something's gone wrong?
It might be a side effect of some things having gone right.
Yeah.
So, for instance, the lessons of Frankl and trying to understand how do you find meaning in death, and particularly in grievously unjust deaths, that requires a kind of deeper view of human nature to grapple with the larger questions. You need something bigger than death to put death into context. And maybe one of our problems is that we've been successful at sidelining death so that many people don't know well those who died or weren't with them when they died. And so death as a daily reality, just by modern life, I think has been reduced. And so I think that that's a good thing. So that's not bad. But there's a sense that, teach us to number our days aright so we may gain wisdom of heart, without the being reminded of death and the bigger context of life. We may not really become wise. That's one thing. But then you compound it with there's a kind of mania for convenience and to reduce every challenge in life. And particularly to come up then with societal solutions to the challenges of individuals. You even see this in a sense, and this is one of Abigail Schreier's ideas, but it's also in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Anxious Generation, that we've been trying to remove challenge from children's lives. Don't let the children play on their own. Don't let them have any responsibility for supervising their own free time or games. So now everything is being done for them by adults, as if the adults' whole purpose is just to reduce the challenge in the lives of children. But that teaches the children, especially the sensitive ones, that challenges are threats. And that makes them prey to anxiety, makes them prey to shame and embarrassment, right? So I see anxiety as an urge to avoid challenge. And so I see that it is the greatest obstacle to growth. Or maybe you could say it's growth on the verge of happening. If they could make use of the adrenaline it gives to actually do the work. And so there's this wonderful thing where adrenaline can be used for work or it can be experienced as anxiety. So I think that we've come to view, the goal is to reduce work, to reduce the need for hard work in people's lives, to have a government supply everything so that people never have to grow through challenge. But I think that there's something here that actually kind of takes away from the ability of people to thrive.
That's great. One of my favorite expression at the end of every freshman convocation, when I welcome the freshmen, is I always say at the end, "Get your boots on." Mm-hmm. They want to. Yeah. So I have two more questions. One is, we're inviting you to help us make schools better. We have a lot of them now, and we influence with others. And what should schools do to help the students, those who have depression and those who don't? How would you? What advice do you have for them?
I think that the best example we can give to model for students how to approach challenge is the very mastery that the teachers themselves have over their subjects and the confidence that they instill then in the students, that the challenges in the subject are actually capable of bringing out their best. So I think that if schools do their work of teaching itself well, that already models for students what it looks like to thrive on challenge. I think classes should be more challenging with enough encouragement on the part of the professor or teacher to help bring out the best in the students. So I think that when you see, there's a lot of studies on what's called self-efficacy, and which is it's a great concept. It's basically the confidence you have that a particular challenge can bring out your best. And if teachers have efficacy for their subject, they will instill efficacy in their students for that same subject.
Do you know what the motto of Hillsdale College is for 180 years?
I'm sorry to say, I don't.
It's just like you. Strength rejoices in the challenge.
That's beautiful.
Isn't it? Yeah. That's why we get our boots on. So that was beautiful and important. My last question is, you are powerfully interested in helping people as a medical doctor specializing in the soul, in God, and in philosophy. Say a word to bring those three things together.
The highest action of a human, I believe, is to attain to silent love for God and others. And that comes to knowing and loving the truth in itself and pursuing it, and then trying to bring that truth into the service of others as much as you can. So there's a sense in which if we have this kind of love, in fact, we are always looking for more and more ways of serving. And we're trying to learn from those around us, to have the humility to learn from everyone, so that we can receive God and give God to everyone.
Kevin Majeres is an inspiring man, and I am very proud to introduce him to those of you who don't know him, and I urge you all to get to know him better. Thank you.
Thank you.